For most of my life, my father's words felt heavier than any failure I'd ever faced. Uneducated, worthless, he said them so casually, like facts instead of wounds, especially when comparing me to my younger sister, the family's pride, the golden child. I learned early how silence could feel safer than speaking, how shrinking myself made others comfortable. But life has a way of circling back to unfinished truths. And one evening, in the same house where my worth was once dismissed, I finally spoke the truth my father never expected to hear. From Amelia, the daughter he thought he knew. The house Amelia grew up in looked warm from the outside, the kind of place neighbors admired with its neat lawn, symmetrical windows, and a porch that suggested stability and order. But inside, language itself felt sharpened, every sentence capable of cutting. Her father, Richard Hale, believed discipline was built through criticism, and that love, if given too freely, made people weak. From the time Amelia could understand words, she understood judgment. It lived in his tone when he asked about her grades, in the sighs he released when she spoke too slowly for his liking, in the way his eyes lingered on her younger sister Clara with unmistakable pride while barely settling on Amelia at all. Richard valued credentials the way others valued kindness. Degrees, titles, awards, these were the currencies of respect in his world. Clara, brilliant and academically driven, fit neatly into his expectations, earning praise that echoed through the house like a permanent reminder of what Amelia was not. Amelia was quieter, thoughtful, drawn to ideas that didn't always translate into report cards or trophies, and for that, she was labeled early. "You don't have the mind for serious things," Richard once told her at the dinner table, his voice calm but final, as if he were diagnosing an illness rather than diminishing his own child. Amelia learned to eat quickly after that, to avoid eye contact, to disappear into herself before someone else erased her for him. The word uneducated became a refrain, used whenever Amelia failed to impress him, whenever she chose a different path, whenever she asked a question he found foolish. He said it with a smirk, not anger, which somehow hurt more because it meant he truly believed it. Worthless followed soon after, usually paired with a comparison, usually spoken loudly enough for Clara to hear, as if humiliation worked best with an audience. Their mother, quiet and conflict-averse, rarely intervened, offering weak smiles or changing the subject, unintentionally confirming that Richard's words were truths no one dared challenge. Amelia began to measure her days by how invisible she could make herself. She stopped sharing her interests, stopped explaining her ideas, stopped defending herself because every attempt felt like walking into a storm without shelter. The house rewarded silence, and so she perfected it. She watched her father beam at Clara's achievements, listened to him brag to relatives about scholarships and future plans, while referring to Amelia as still figuring things out, a phrase that carried disappointment like a shadow. No one asked what she dreamed of anymore, and eventually she stopped asking herself out loud too. Yet, even in that environment, something stubborn lived inside her, quiet but unbroken. Amelia paid attention. She listened. She learned outside the lines drawn for her, absorbing knowledge through curiosity rather than classrooms, developing skills that didn't come with applause but with patience and practice. Still, inside that house, none of it mattered. Richard's words had already decided who she was, and repetition made them feel permanent. Every insult etched itself deeper, shaping how she stood, how she spoke, how she doubted herself before anyone else could. By the time Amelia reached adulthood, she believed love was conditional and respect had to be earned through someone else's standards. The house had taught her that language could be used not to guide, but to dominate, not to correct, but to wound. She carried those lessons with her when she finally left, unaware that one day she would return not to seek approval, but to confront the echoes of every word that had once defined her, carrying a truth her father had never bothered to learn about her at all. Amelia learned early that dreaming was safest when done in private, in a house where confidence was mistaken for arrogance, unless it came with certificates to prove it. Her imagination became something she guarded fiercely, tucking it away behind polite nods and obedient silence. She was not loud like Clara, not competitive in the ways her father admired, and so her inner world grew in the absence of encouragement. While others measured intelligence by grades and accolades, Amelia's mind wandered through patterns, possibilities, and ideas that didn't fit neatly into exams or expectations. And because no one asked her what she was thinking, she learned how to think deeply without being seen. At school, teachers described her as average, a word that followed her home and found validation in her father's dismissive nods. No one noticed how she stayed up late teaching herself skills that fascinated her, how she borrowed books outside the syllabus, how she absorbed information with a patience that didn't need applause. She watched the world carefully, learning how people spoke, how systems worked, how success often favored confidence over competence, and she stored those observations quietly, like tools she might one day need. Being overlooked hurt, but it also made her invisible enough to grow without interference. Richard never asked how she spent her time because he had already decided it wasn't worth knowing. When Amelia tried, once or twice, to share something she was excited about, he waved it off as impractical, a waste of energy better spent on real education. Each dismissal reinforced the lesson that her interests were burdens, that curiosity without permission was a flaw. So she stopped sharing and started building her life internally, creating a private sense of purpose that did not rely on his approval. She learned resilience not as a dramatic act of defiance, but as a quiet refusal to disappear completely. What no one saw was how much discipline it took to keep going without encouragement. Amelia failed often, learned slowly, retried patiently, and improved steadily, all without praise to motivate her. She made peace with being underestimated, even used it to her advantage because expectations placed on her were so low that no one noticed her progress. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she acted, and over time that attentiveness sharpened into insight. While others rushed toward validation, she built foundations, brick by invisible brick. Family gatherings reinforced her role as the unremarkable one. Conversations flowed around her, achievements were celebrated that had nothing to do with her, and jokes about her indecision or lack of direction landed without apology. Amelia smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because reacting would only confirm their assumptions. Inside, she held on to the knowledge that not all growth is loud, not all intelligence announces itself, and not all worth is visible in the moment. She learned to separate how she was seen from who she was becoming. There were nights when doubt crept in, when her father's voice echoed louder than her own thoughts, when she wondered if everyone else was right and she truly lacked substance. But even then, something steady pulled her forward, a belief that her path did not have to resemble anyone else's to be meaningful. She began to trust her instincts, to value progress over praise, and to understand that being overlooked did not mean being empty. It simply meant her story was unfolding in a place no one else thought to look, waiting patiently for the moment when quiet persistence would finally have the space to speak for itself. Amelia did not meet Ethan Brooks during a moment of confidence or clarity. She met him at a time when she still carried her father's voice inside her head, quietly questioning her worth before she ever spoke. It was an ordinary encounter, unremarkable to anyone else, but from the beginning there was something disarming about the way Ethan listened. He did not interrupt, did not correct her phrasing, did not rush to evaluate whether her thoughts were impressive enough to matter. When Amelia spoke, halting and careful as if expecting dismissal, he waited, giving her words the space they had never been allowed to occupy before. Ethan noticed things others overlooked. He noticed how Amelia hesitated before sharing opinions, how she softened statements that were already thoughtful, how she apologized for taking up time. Instead of reinforcing those habits, he gently disrupted them by asking questions that assumed intelligence rather than tested it. He didn't praise her in exaggerated ways or try to rescue her from insecurity. He simply treated her mind as something worth engaging with. That alone began to change how Amelia heard herself think because, for the first time, her ideas were met with curiosity instead of correction. Their conversations stretched longer than expected, drifting from practical matters into reflections about work, purpose, and the invisible pressures people carry. Amelia found herself revealing pieces of her inner world she had kept hidden, and Ethan received them without surprise, as if he had known all along they were there. When she spoke about her family, about being compared and diminished, he didn't rush to contradict her experiences or minimize the damage. He listened, believed her, and acknowledged the weight of growing up unseen, which felt more validating than any reassurance ever could. What startled Amelia most was how naturally Ethan believed in her, not as a project to fix or a potential to unlock, but as a capable person already in motion. He encouraged her ambitions without reshaping them into something more respectable or recognizable. When she doubted herself, he didn't argue. He reminded her of what she had already done, quietly and consistently, without needing permission. His support was steady rather than dramatic, present in small gestures and thoughtful words that accumulated into trust over time. Through Ethan, Amelia experienced a different kind of partnership, one built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. He never positioned himself above her or spoke on her behalf. Instead, he stood beside her, making space for her to grow at her own pace. With him, she didn't feel the need to perform intelligence or defend her worth. She could be uncertain, curious, learning, and still be valued. That safety allowed parts of her personality long suppressed to emerge. Confidence that wasn't loud, strength that didn't need to prove itself. As their relationship deepened, Amelia began to recognize how much she had internalized from her father's judgments and how those beliefs had shaped her self-perception. Ethan didn't erase that history, but he offered a living alternative, showing her through everyday consistency that respect could exist without conditions. Loving him did not mean losing herself. It meant finally being seen as she was, not as a comparison or a disappointment, but as a whole person whose worth had never been missing, only ignored. And in that recognition, Amelia started to believe that being seen was not a luxury, but something she had deserved all along. Putting physical distance between herself and her family felt less like an act of rebellion and more like an act of survival. Amelia didn't announce her departure with dramatic speeches or final arguments. She simply left, carrying with her a quiet determination to build a life where her worth was not constantly questioned. The space she created by stepping away was unfamiliar at first, almost unsettling because it removed the constant echo of her father's judgments. In that silence, she had to learn how to define herself without opposition, how to move forward without waiting for permission or bracing for criticism. Away from home, Amelia's days took on a rhythm shaped by effort and intention, rather than fear. She invested herself fully in her work, applying the same patience and discipline she had developed in isolation, and the results began to show. Her skills sharpened, her confidence grew gradually, and opportunities emerged not because she demanded attention, but because her consistency made her impossible to overlook. Each small success reinforced a truth she was only beginning to accept. Competence did not require validation to exist, and progress did not need an audience to be real. Yet, with her family, almost nothing changed. Phone calls remained surface level, updates carefully filtered to avoid commentary or comparison. When Richard asked about her life, his questions carried the same skepticism, and Amelia answered vaguely, protecting her achievements from being minimized or mocked. It became easier to let them believe she was still drifting, still unremarkable, than to expose something she had built so carefully to the risk of dismissal. That choice created a strange duality in her life, where she was capable and respected in one world and underestimated in another. This double existence was exhausting in ways she rarely acknowledged. Amelia learned how to shift versions of herself depending on who she was speaking to, lowering her voice around family, simplifying her language, shrinking her presence to fit old expectations. With colleagues and peers, she stood taller, spoke with clarity, and trusted her expertise. The contrast was stark and sometimes painful because it revealed how much of herself she had learned to hide to maintain peace. Still, she endured it, believing that distance gave her control and control gave her safety. Ethan remained the one constant across both worlds, aware of the truth Amelia guarded and the cost of carrying it alone. He never pushed her to confront her family before she was ready, understanding that healing was not linear and strength did not always look like confrontation. Instead, he reminded her of her progress, of the woman she was becoming, especially on days when old doubts resurfaced. Through his support, Amelia began to see that the double life she lived was not deception, but a temporary shelter, a way to grow strong enough before stepping into the light. Over time, the balance began to shift. The identity Amelia built in distance grew heavier than the one her family assigned her, more real, more grounded. She felt less dependent on their perceptions and more anchored in her own sense of self. What once felt like hiding began to feel like preparation, a quiet accumulation of truth waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud, when silence would no longer serve her and the life she had built would finally demand to be acknowledged. The invitation arrived casually, almost thoughtlessly, as if it were just another routine family gathering, but Amelia felt its weight the moment she read it. A dinner at her parents' house, a rare occasion where everyone would be present, including relatives who still viewed her through the outdated lens her father had crafted years ago. She considered declining, knowing how easily those walls could pull her back into old patterns, but something in her had shifted. Distance had given her clarity, and growth had given her steadiness, and for the first time, she felt capable of walking back into that house without shrinking to fit its expectations. From the moment Amelia stepped inside, the familiar tension settled around her shoulders. The furniture was the same, the lighting unchanged, but she was not. Conversations flowed predictably, orbiting around Claire's accomplishments, career milestones, and future plans, all punctuated by Richard's proud commentary. Amelia listened quietly, not with resignation this time, but with awareness, observing how easily the narrative of worth was still shaped and reinforced. When the attention finally turned toward her, it came with the same thinly veiled skepticism she had learned to expect. Richard's voice cut through the table with practiced ease, his words dressed as humor but sharpened with intent. He joked about Amelia's wandering path, about how some people simply weren't built for serious education or ambition, and laughter followed, uncomfortable but complicit. The old sting surfaced, instinctive and sharp, but it didn't consume her. Instead, Amelia felt something settle inside her, a calm resolve that surprised even her. She realized that this moment, so familiar in structure, felt different because she no longer believed the version of herself being described. She set down her fork slowly, allowing the silence to grow just enough to be noticed. When she spoke, her voice was steady, unhurried and clear, carrying none of the defensiveness that had once betrayed her uncertainty. She didn't argue or justify herself. She simply spoke the truth, piece by piece, about her work, her achievements, and the life she had built away from their assumptions. Each sentence landed with quiet force, not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted everything they thought they knew. The table shifted. Conversations stalled. Faces changed. Clara looked at her with something between surprise and reconsideration, as if seeing her sister for the first time without comparison. Richard's expression hardened, then faltered, caught between disbelief and the dawning realization that he had been wrong. Amelia continued, not to impress, but to reclaim herself, explaining how distance had allowed her to grow, how being underestimated had never stopped her from becoming capable, and how she no longer accepted definitions of worth that excluded her humanity. There was no outburst, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. The power of the moment lay in its restraint. Amelia did not seek apology or validation. She simply refused to be reduced any longer. The room absorbed the weight of her words, and in that charged stillness she felt something release. A lifetime of swallowed responses finally given air. She looked at her father not with anger, but with clarity, understanding that his approval was no longer the measure of her value, and as the silence stretched, it became clear that the story they had told about her could no longer survive in the presence of who she truly was. The silence that followed Amelia's words was unlike any she had known in that house before. It was not the heavy, oppressive quiet she grew up with, where her thoughts went unheard and her presence felt optional. This silence carried weight, filled with unspoken realizations and discomfort, settling over the dining table like a truth no one had prepared for. Amelia sat still, feeling neither triumphant nor afraid, only grounded in a way she had never experienced in her father's presence. For the first time, she was not waiting for a reaction to define what her truth meant. Richard was the last to speak, and when he did, his voice lacked the certainty that once ruled the room. The confidence he wore so easily had fractured, revealing hesitation beneath it. He looked at Amelia longer than he ever had before, as if trying to reconcile the daughter he had dismissed with the woman sitting across from him. Regret did not arrive in apologies or softened language. It appeared in his silence, in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the realization that the authority he relied on had failed him. He had mistaken control for guidance and criticism for motivation, and now the consequences of those choices stood calmly before him. Clara shifted uneasily, her earlier pride replaced by reflection. For years she had benefited from comparison without questioning its cost, and now she faced the truth that her success had been used as a weapon against her own sister. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed Amelia with a new awareness, one that acknowledged the imbalance they had both lived under. Amelia felt no resentment toward her. She understood how easily roles are assigned in families and how rarely they are examined until someone breaks them open. What surprised Amelia most was the absence of anger within herself. She had imagined this moment countless times, expecting release through confrontation or satisfaction through validation. But what she felt instead was quiet closure. She no longer needed her father to admit his mistakes or recognize her achievements. The power of reclaiming her worth came from owning it fully, without requiring anyone else's permission. The house that once shrank her now felt smaller than she was, unable to contain the woman she had become.